Now let's start with the home page. The goal here is to show the featured events, and therefore here we want to get all featured events. For this, in the dummy data.js file, I did prepare a getFeaturedEvents function which is exported, which accesses the dummy events array and then filters for events where the isFeatured flag is set to true. And all these event objects do have a isFeatured flag, which is either false or true. Hence here, we can now get all our featured events by using this getFeaturedEvents function. Now for this, you need to import it from dummy data, of course. You need to import getFeaturedEvents from dummy data. So call getFeaturedEvents, it's a function, so make sure you execute it and store the result in a featuredEvents constant. And now that we got the featured events, we want to output them down there. Now for this, we can add an unordered list here where we loop through all the featured events, but I will actually create a brand new standard React component for that. Because it is generally a good practice to split your application and your JSX code into multiple smaller building blocks, into multiple components therefore, and then combine those components to compose your overall application from those components. Hence, we want to add a regular React component. And the question now is, where do we store such a component? That is generally up to you, but it should not be in the pages folder. In the pages folder, you should only have page components, because whichever files you create in here, those files will then automatically lead to routes being generated. So Next.js will pick up any files stored in pages and generate routes for them. And for the regular components, we don't want that. A list component here should not be reachable through a route. Instead, I want to use it in the JSX code of some other component, of this homepage component, for example. And therefore, you don't store regular components in the pages folder, but instead we create a brand new folder, for example, one named components. But you can use any name you want, but components is a name that of course makes sense, I would argue. Now in there, I will add an events subfolder where I want to store all my events related components. And then in this events subfolder, I will add a file, an event list.js file, which will hold the event list component. Regarding the file naming, it's up to you how you want to name this. You will also often see a file naming convention like this for JavaScript files that hold React components. For example, I use this notation in my React course. In Next projects, I often saw this notation, so all lowercase cap uppercase, and therefore I will stick to it, but it is totally up to you. There is no best practice or a bad way of doing it. You can name those files however you want. And now in the event list.js file, I want to set up my event list functional component, which will be responsible for rendering a list of events. Hence, it will use props because those events should be passed in from outside so that we can reuse the same event list component on the home page, where we then have some featured events, and on the all events page where we have a long list of all events. The event list component shouldn't care about where the events are coming from, but it should only care about outputting the events. Hence, it receives props so that the actual event items are passed in from outside, from the place where the event data is fetched. Hence, in here, I just in the end want to return an unordered list with all those events, and then simply expect that on the props, we get our, let's say, items prop. And I'm using object destructuring to pull that prop out of the props object. Of course, you don't need to do that. You could also just write props.items down there. I used object destructuring, so I will just write items, but that's up to you. Of course, the key here the key name you use is also up to you. It doesn't have to be items. That's just a name I will be using here, but since it's your component, you can name this however you want. So then we have those items, and now we want to map through them to output multiple list items. So to map our item object data, which has this shape here, into a list item, into a JSX element. And therefore, we go through all the events in the end, we pass an anonymous function to map, and then create a list item for every event we're getting here. Now, before we continue working on that, I will export this event list component, and I now want to create a brand new component which actually defines the JSX code for such a single event list item. So therefore, I'll add a new file next to the event list JavaScript file, and that's the event item.js file. Now again, the file name of course is up to you. And in here, in this file, I'll add a function, event item. I also expect some props here, because the concrete data for a single rendered event item also should be coming from outside of this component here. And of course, we also want to export this event item. And now in here, I want to return a list item and then set up all the HTML code in the end that defines how such an event item should be output. We'll work on that in a second. First of all, in event list.js, we can now import event item from ./event item, so from that file we just added, and then map our events to event item objects like this, so to event item components in the end. And now we need to pass some data into event item, the event data we're getting here in the event list component. And in event item, we then define the JSX structure for this. And that's what we're going to do in the next lecture.